Hello, I am Pablo Nemo, and today I would like to do something different. Instead of music, I would like to talk about philosophy. In particular, the metaphysics of Alfred North Whitehead, the so-called philosophy of organism. First of all, just to contextualize it, I would like to discuss why I would like to do such thing, especially considering how the current situation in the world has very pressing issues. It may seem that thinking about metaphysics may be a bit insignificant or not relevant when there are other things that are more pressing matters, such as the rise of fascism or how climate change is having devastating effects, or like genocide that is happening in front of our eyes, or the impact that we feel in day to day with the cost of living. I will argue that all of these issues are part of a bigger meta problem, which some people like to call the Metacrisis. And the Metacrisis is at the same time a product of other causes, such as the isms that dominate this epoch, such as capitalism, individualism, and specifically materialism. And here I would like to quote Iain McGilchrist and his book The Master and His Emissary, because according to him, most of these issues that are causing the metacrisis are due to the way in which we pay attention to the world. We are thinking about the world in a very specific way, just focusing on the details and thinking about things in isolation. Instead of considering the whole picture, we are using a reductionist lens, and that has as consequence a lot of these big issues. For some, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And to help with imagining such an abstract paradigm shift, I think that's where process philosophy comes in handy. To introduce it very briefly, with reductionist materialism, we see the world as objects, as nouns, as things with static properties, or a bit like the Aristotelian concept of substance, in which something can be defined in isolation and has implicit inherent properties, and that doesn't really change. If you change the relationship of that substance, that object, to the world, the object remains the same and has a hierarchical structure, like the components are inferior to the things that make us a whole. In the process philosophy paradigm, things are quite different. Instead of having nouns as subjects, we have verbs, we have action. And mostly what the main principles of such philosophy has to do with having dynamic relationships between entities. Everything is based on how they relate to other things. Isolation doesn't make any sense. If you isolate something from the environment, it stops being what it was in that environment. As such, it's a very organic philosophy, and in fact some philosophers like Whitehead, for example, consider that any entity, any event even, is actually a form of organism. It's also not as hierarchical as the determinist object substance based paradigm, because it has a more rhizomatic structure, a network in which there are hierarchies, but one doesn't predominate to the other. In fact, the relationships can be both horizontal and vertical, and it doesn't only go from the top to the bottom, but it goes both ways. But of course, this philosophy doesn't come out of thin air. There are precedents to it. And I would like to clarify that I am not part of any of the cultures or religions that I'm about to mention, so take it with a pinch of salt. But there are some examples of ancient cultures, such as in the Vedas of Hinduism. Later in Buddhism, we find things such as the concept of Indra's net, in which it depicts the universe as a net, a network, and in each of the crossings between the threads there is a droplet of water, and that droplet reflects all the other droplets that are in the net. And that's actually a very good representation of how I imagine the world as described by process philosophy. Also, in Confucianism and Taoism, we find a greater focus on change and things as a flow rather than being static entities, and also acknowledging the organic nature of everything. Even household objects in Shintoism have a spirit of their own. And in Greece, in the pre-Socratic philosophers, we find a couple of examples of the concept of flow as well. In Heraclitus of Ephesus, I'm mispronouncing a lot, sorry about that, and in Thales of Miletus, which emphasize change above all else. However, I will argue that in order to have change, you also need order and permanence, but that's for later. In modern times, we have philosophers such as Henri Bergson. Not very familiar with his work, so I will not talk about it. We have Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, which have a very particular approach to process philosophy. I kinda like it, but I haven't delved very deep. I've read a bit of the Thousand Plateaus and the Capitalism and Schizophrenia, and I like how they relate it to some modern situations, but at the same time it feels a bit too poetic for my taste. So I ended up studying the work of Alfred North Whitehead, specifically process and philosophy, because I was attracted to his seriousness, I guess, his very structure. Especially I am aware that he wrote with Walter Russell the book, the Principia Mathematica, which is the foundation on top of which to unify all of the different fields of mathematics. So I thought, if someone has a very thorough metaphysical system, it's probably Whitehead. And also, I heard that his theory is called the philosophy of organism. Something intuitively told me, yes, this is the book for me. However, I would like to say that Process and Philosophy is a very, very dry book, and it's quite hard to understand because it's organized in a rhizomatic, organic way, which implies that to describe one thing, you have to describe everything else in the system. So it doesn't follow a very straightforward sequence of descriptions or events, which I actually kinda understand, I see the point, but it makes learning about it very difficult. I do recommend to read A Key to Whitehead's Philosophy by Donald Sherburne, I think is how do you pronounce it, which makes it far more intuitive to learn. And if you speak Spanish, The channel of Darin McNabb, La Fonda Filosófica, has some absolutely brilliant explanations of the philosophy of Whitehead. At the core of process and reality is the concept of creativity. And in fact, Whitehead supposedly coined the term creativity, although there is some debate about that. But for his system, creativity is the universal principle, the ultimate law of reality. And it simply is the principle that allows the many, the universe of separate, distinct entities, to come together into a bigger unity as the universe as one thing, that at the same time joins the many elements. It becomes one instance of the world. And that has a few interesting effects. Well, basically the whole book is about the effects of such a dynamic process. The most obvious one is the process of emergence. You can have one entity, A, and you can have something different, B, and by combining them you get a third thing. AB, it becomes C, for example. But then you have more things to play with. Now you have A, B, and AB, which is C, and you can recombine them. And that creates a chain reaction that allows you to do quite a few things. For example, you can organize them in terms of what is composed of what else. So you can have things that are components of other things, and you can synthesize them by the process that Whitehead calls transmutation into a bigger entity. So what was many but transmutes into a nexus, a conjunction of different elements, and becomes a higher level, a macro organism, while the elements become the micro elements, creating a hierarchy of sorts. However, as I mentioned before, this hierarchy is not simply linear, but rather it goes both ways, like both the things that are composed of smaller parts can be affected by the smaller parts and affect those parts at the same time. So there is a dual flux. But also, by combining A and B and C and then D and such, you also create a chain of events, creating novelty, bringing novelty into the world rather. But that novelty doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not simply, as some scientists say, an emergent property and then full stop and don't explain what emergence entails. And in fact, it comes from the field of possibilities. That field of possibilities, that possibility space, can be thought of as either eternal objects or the extensive continuum. Eternal objects are not the same as in Plato's theory of ideas. They are instead the realm of possibility space. That take some particular forms as particular concepts. For example, we can have the concept of geometry, and inside the concept of geometry you can have the sub-concept of a square, for example, or the number pi, etc. And also it differs from Platonic ideas in regards that it's not simply ideal objects, for example the ideal of a table, but rather it has subspecies that are way more specific. It simply is the realm of conceptual possibility. And if we strip it down to the bare essential components, if we go far away from things that we are familiar with, such as, for example, electromagnetism, shape, form, or geometry, the underlying field that allows for the existence of those derivative concepts is the extensive continuum. By the way, I'm simplifying a lot, I'm not going to get into details, and honestly I don't understand this fully myself, but I'll just giving you a rundown of concepts just so we can discuss their applications a bit later. And of course, those conceptual entities, the eternal objects, are not what we usually experience in real life, in the real world of physical entities. Those are actual entities or real entities or actual events. In fact, the terms actual and real can be exchanged both with entity and event, which is quite interesting because, as we mentioned, for Whitehead there is no such thing as an inert static object. Everything is constantly perishing and becoming something else. So it's quite appropriate to think about the world as composed of events rather than simply objects that change. And actually, each instance of those events doesn't change on its own. It is an atomic instant, like a particular, basically instantaneous moment of existence, of becoming, that becomes a chain reaction for the next and is inherited through what Whitehead calls objective immortality. Well, objective immortality rather is the preservation of the past, but the way in which the one entity becomes something else and is inherited towards the future is through prehensions, which can also be described as feelings. The most simple one of those is physical feelings, which are similar to what we can consider as forces in physics, but they go a little bit beyond that. They have more characteristics. It's not simply the transmission of energy. Transmission of energy is a particular type of physical feeling, but there are other types as well. And as we mentioned before, actual entities are composed. Remember the picture of the net with the droplets reflecting everything else? Those reflections are given to the entity by those prehensions. That's the way in which it has to interact with the rest of the physical world and to absorb it as well. So it's not simply that it is reflecting, it is actually part of that entity. Of course, that entity cannot be everything all at once, so it has to filter quite drastically what it can feel from other entities, and this is done by objectifications. And by objectifying the environment that is relevant to that entity, it can feel the physical prehensions. Those physical prehensions as well ingress conceptual prehensions from eternal objects. So those are felt as well, but similarly, instead of feeling everything all at once, they are filtered by relevance and by similarity. So if the physical feeling is somewhat resonant with a conceptual feeling, those will integrate into a satisfaction, which is their combination into a new entity that encompasses both feelings. I'm forgetting something. I'm forgetting a lot of things. Yes, this is a very complicated thing, as I mentioned. I'm not going to get into much detail. We can see in the middle of this picture as well the process I described before of combining several actual entities into one, and consider that one as a single entity, so the process of transmutation, and the compound we will either call a nexus or a society, with the distinction being that a nexus is mostly connected through physical feeling and is massive in terms of Whitehead, so it has the properties of mass and of extensiveness, while societies also share properties between those different elements, and those properties are inflicted upon each other. It's like societal norms, like yes, there is the court of law, but all the citizens are reinforcing the laws of a society in itself. So kinda like that, not really, but kinda. The comparison between physical feeling and conceptual feeling, which comes from eternal objects, is a proposition. Those propositions are also synthesized once again into a final integration of feeling in an instant that encompasses all that the entity can feel, which is the satisfaction of that moment. And in its final satisfaction, that entity perishes. And it's important to keep in mind that this is not a process that happens inside of time, but rather time is a byproduct of this process, which, by the way, is called concrescence. And in fact, allow me to put a link over here, because I made a little song that focuses more on the process of concrescence. But in the end, the whole world is a process of concrescence that will become a final satisfaction, which will be that will be the consequent nature of God, which is God viewed as the final singularity of the process of existence. But for Whitehead, God is not just that, it's also primordial in nature, which means that is the extensive continuum itself, is the complete summation of all possibilities, both real potentialities and general abstract concepts beyond what we'll realize. And as a primordial being of pure potential is abstract and it lacks substance and causal efficacy. However, it has potential, and it transmits that potential as a conceptual feeling to entities during this process of becoming. So it provides each entity with the initial subjective aim that will be a lure of feeling. It's like pushing it towards the direction of what they can become. But of course, as well as being the primordial original conceptual force and being the final unity of the synthesis of concrescence of the universe, for Whitehead, God is also present in each moment of each entity as it is going through in the temporal world of the many disjunctive entities. But yeah, that was a handful. Let's move on. I cannot really do justice to Whitehead's theory in such a short introduction video, but for the sake of brevity, let's move on into more practical matters, because as I mentioned in the beginning, how can metaphysics be put into practice in the real world and actually help us change the situation in which we find ourselves on? From metaphysics, the easiest step is to go into physics. And here I find that the Wolfram Physics of Stephen Wolfram is actually somewhat similar. For Stephen Wolfram, reality is not composed of fields or of particles, as in traditional, quantum physics and relativity, but rather is a hypergraph, which is basically a very complex collection of relationships, once again resembling Indra's net. But it's also computational, so those nexus, those vertices, are changing according to certain properties of the whole graph. And in fact, I find quite useful, this is quite useful to understand the concept of the extensive continuum, which in Wolfram terms could be described as the Rullian, which is the maximum complete picture of what all possibilities of connections and of graphs could be. In Wolfram Physics there are some things that are quite insightful. For example, we find the concept of irreducible complexity, which kinda reminds me of the process of concrescence, because there are some computations that are not reducible through mathematics. Mathematics can be quite useful to predict some particular systems, but there are some other things that go beyond that. The only way that you can actually compute or calculate what is going to happen is to let that happen. A classic example of this are chaotic systems, like chaotic pendulums or the three-body problem, in which if you have, for example, three bodies orbiting because of gravity, it is very, very, very hard to predict how the system is going to evolve over time, and it's actually very, very sensitive to errors. So with mathematics it will deviate after a period of time, so it's very hard to predict, and the best way to actually find out what it will happen is to let it happen. And that makes me think a bit of free will, because perhaps according to this whole system it could be that the universe is predetermined and is deterministic rather, because it was already embedded in the structure of the extensive continuum and in the field of eternal objects and the initial push of subjective aim. However, the only way to realize what it will become is by becoming, which I think is rather poetic. In fact, it reminds me of in the manga Vagabond, there is this monk called Takuan, which is based on a real figure, but I don't know the name of the real one. Basically, he says that all the paths have been traced and therefore were infinitely free, which is very poetic, very beautiful. I like it. At the same time, we have in Wolfram Physics the concept of causal invariance. It mostly applies to quantum physics and to how to condensate the many different branching paths and the different possibilities. How come that out of all of those possible states, when we actually measure something and when it actually happens in reality, there is only one outcome out of all of those possibilities? And according to causal invariance, it is because they are equivalent. It doesn't matter if you went first left and then right, or you went first right and then left, you are in the middle anyway. But also, the potential of Wolfram Physics is the little pockets of predictability that this theory allows us. Because in that irreducible complexity and chaotic systems, not everything is unpredictable and chaotic. There are some possibility spaces inside the theory that are predictable and can be computationally calculated. So yeah, very interesting stuff. Possibly the best example of how to apply the concepts of found in Whitehead's theory is in the work of Michael Levin and his team at Tufts University. They are mostly doing things with biology, but it's a very interdisciplinary team, and they also deal with philosophy and computer science and all sorts of things. I highly recommend to check out his work. I'll leave a link somewhere around here. We can see a striking similarity, for example, in how he regards the morphogenetic space, which are, for example, patterns of form and behavior. Because for Michael Levin, the concept of emergent properties is not enough, and he aims to map the possibility spaces instead of just being like, oh yeah, sometimes this happens because of the combinations. It's like, yeah, but why? How? One example of how his team is doing this is with the experiments that they are doing with planaria worms, which are like little flatworms that have fantastic regeneration properties. For example, they have been trying to discover how the development of the embryo can change depending on the conditions of the environment, of genetic material, etc. Mostly the environment. In fact, usually he emphasizes that with the same given genetic material, in fact, planaria has some very messy genes, and they are able to utilize that in different ways. This also is backed by Dennis Noble, which also thinks that genetics is not enough to justify how actual living beings develop. But yeah, basically with the team at Tufts, they are mapping the different possibilities in morphogenetic space of how planarias can develop, and also based on that they can do some funky things like chop a little planaria, and when that planaria regenerates, it could either grow back one head or it can grow back more than one, and they can do that in a non-deterministic way, which is very interesting. Also, another very good example of how Whitehead's thoughts applies to biology is in what Michael Levin calls the self-let, which we can consider as a photogram in some living being's life. We usually think of entities of living beings, for example, as a continuum. From the moment they are born until the moment they are dead is the same entity. However, for Michael Levin, it's better to think of that process not as a single entity, but rather as a collection of different self-lets, like different photograms that make a whole movie. This has some interesting repercussions. For example, you can use this framework to think about the inheritance of memory, and also consider memory not just a simple passive storage of information, but rather as also another entity that is becoming in the environment provided by the mind of the organism that is hosting such memory. And they did some experiments with caterpillars that turned into butterflies, and they were training the caterpillars to recognize some colors. I think it was colors, not sure. Basically to train them to recognize something as beneficial for them as food, And even though through the process of metamorphosis the caterpillar will change dramatically, from having a soft body, very flexible, that lives in a 2D environment because they don't really need height, and that focuses on chewing leaves as the subsistence, they become butterflies, which live in a 3D environment because they fly and have a hard exoskeleton, so the movements are completely different, and even their concept of food is different because what they want is nectar, not leaves. But the memory adapts to the new environment of the new body and the new mind, and can survive through their changes and through the adaptation to that different body and environment. This happens through what we can see as an encoding, bottleneck, and decoding. So as memories are reducing to the essential components, what will be inherited by the future organism, and the future organism is reinterpreting it freely, kinda like improvising a little bit, which is similar to how the process of concrescence works. We have this bottleneck of satisfaction that synthesizes the physical feeling and the conceptual feeling, creates a singularity, and then grows back again into a new entity, a new reality. Also, they propose the model of the cognitive light cone, which is similar to light cones in special relativity, but this is applied to what an organism can perceive. And in fact, they are applying this framework to, for example, treat cancer cells, because cancer is essentially a cell that has forgotten that is part of a higher organism and goes rogue, goes independent, and only focuses on the survival of itself. And they have managed to change cancer cells from going rogue to reincorporate into the surrounding tissue and become normal cells again, just by communicating, quote unquote, with them through electromagnetic fields and through the cell boundaries. It's very interesting. I don't know enough the technicalities to be able to express it, and once again it's beyond the scope of this presentation. But yeah, check out Michael Levin's work, it's absolutely amazing. Process philosophy also gives us some insights into the nature of consciousness. For Whitehead, consciousness is a property of self-reflexivity. As part of the process of concrescence, where the physical feeling and the conception feeling are compared into a proposition, as a contrast, that proposition can also be compared to itself, giving that self-reflectivity that is quite characteristic of consciousness. So people, inspired by this omnipresent nature of the organism, especially Stuart Hameroff, are inspired to look deeper into consciousness in a more open way, similar to what Michael Levin was describing. So together with Roger Penrose, they developed the model of orchestrated objective reduction, OR. In that model, they propose that consciousness is not an emergent property of the mind, but rather is based on occasions of experience that, by combining in a complex way, give rise to what we experience as consciousness. That has a very big advantage over the neuron brain-based models, because that accounts for example, how bacteria can think in a way, because bacteria can navigate an environment and hence behave in ways that are intelligent without having any neurons whatsoever. For them, the way in which this process works is that atomic events like quantum fluctuations are essentially the smallest, well, maybe not the smallest, but very small forms of proto-consciousness, proto-conscious experience. And to integrate into a more cohesive whole, we have microtubules inside of cells, not only in the neurons and in the brain, but pretty much any cell, I think at least eukaryotic, has those structures inside that were thought to be mere scaffolding, but they seem to display some properties of computation and other quantum phenomena like fluorescence. Yeah, the details once again, let's not focus into that. But inside the microtubules, those quantum phenomena in benzene rings synchronize, become entangled, until they reach a threshold in which they fire, they trigger the collapse of the wave function. And that cycle of starting with independent molecules that combine by entanglement and then disperse again is the cycle of consciousness. Those are the rhythms of proto-thought. Another theory that is quite interesting and accounts for the relational nature of consciousness is the nested observer windows by Justin Riddle and someone else whose name I forgot, sorry about that. The now model. In this case, they also acknowledge that the brain is a big part of conscious experience, but it's not sufficient. And in fact, different brain regions seem to have their own functionalities, and neurons have their own functionalities. So what this model proposes is that consciousness is basically a nested system of layers that interact both ways, from top to bottom and bottom to top, similar to what we mentioned before when we were talking about creativity and emergence. And the way in which the different levels of consciousness communicates is through rhythm, both with synchrony, by things firing at the same time, through coherence, by having similar frequency ranges, and also across the different levels. It happens through cross-frequency coupling. So let's say, and actually that also happens in the orchestrated objective reduction model, in which different levels are resonant through multiplication, kinda. Let's say that one level is 10 times, exactly 10 times faster than the other, or exactly 3 times faster than the other. By being resonant with an integer number, that allows for cross-frequency coupling. And since different levels of organization inside the human body and mind are conscious in different ways, that raises the question of whether humanity as an organism is conscious as well. That's the task of sociology, to understand how that organism behaves. And also process philosophy has something to say about it. In fact, one branch of sociology is relational sociology, that defines identity as the relationships that formed it through the development of one person. But I think it's also interesting to consider the concept of personhood for Whitehead, because as we mentioned before, talking about Levin, organisms are instantaneous frames. What we consider a person, or what we consider an enduring entity, is actually a chain reaction of different becomings. And with that in mind, it becomes way more easy to understand changes. because some people are very attached to their identity and they consider who they are to be something static and even eternal. But however, if we consider that personhood is not about being, it's not a substance that cannot change, but rather is a process of becoming, it becomes more natural to understand that personality and identity also changes and flows. This is very relevant for gender and for sexuality, but also for ideology, because I will consider that some issues are due to people being overly attached to what they consider to be their ideology. They identify with a particular ideology, and if you have criticism about it, it's like you are criticizing them. However, if you recognize that your ideology can change as well as your identity, it's easier to be more open-minded and consider, okay, this is what I think right now, but the person that I will be in the future may think something different. And in terms of relational sociology, there is the principle of enlightened egotism, which has some caveats, but to describe it simply, it is better to be just one more in a thriving society than to be the king of the ashes. Because even if you manage to be better and superior than all the others, if you do it at the cost of the whole of which you are part to degrade, it is also bad for you. However, if you make the whole thrive, you are thriving together with that whole. And since we're talking about making the whole thrive, obviously that whole should not be limited just to humans. But of course, as we know, we live in an ecological crisis. I think the insights of process philosophy can also be applied to ecology. I in particular find permaculture quite interesting because the core model proposes that instead of doing things willy-nilly and trying to force nature to do what we basically fancy at that moment, it is wiser to try to create a symbiosis with it by understanding the cycles present in nature, not only in terms of weather and the seasons, but also like different areas and different regions have different properties that are mostly based around the principle of concentration and dispersion. There are places and times when energy and nutrients and other resources concentrate, while there are other times and other places or other situations in which those concentrated properties disperse. And if we are able to recognize in which part of that cycle we are located, it is way easier to be in harmony with it and to have a symbiotic relationship with it. Arcologies, in the other hand, are quite interesting because obviously if we are like 7 billion people in the world right now, and it doesn't seem that it's going to change anytime soon, that number. If we try to simply go back to nature, there is no place for us where too many people, and the effect will be even more devastating. So what the solution that Arcology proposes is to create cities in a way that are more self-sufficient and that have less impact on their environment, especially by doing three-dimensional structures instead of spreading in just the surface of the earth, we have the ability to build things also in height. So together with permaculture, it could lead towards a very different layout of how humans live in the planet in the future. But even more fundamentally, we have to acknowledge the value of life on all of its forms, whether they are useful for humans or not. And that's the task of deep ecology, which also resonates with a lot of the things that Michael Levin is studying. And this is also the main task of object-oriented ontology. It is not quite the same as process philosophy, it has some striking differences. Personally, I haven't read any object-oriented ontology books yet, but I've been looking into it and it seems to be truly fascinating. Finally, I would like to talk about the potential applications of process philosophy in different arts. I think it is especially relevant since with generative AI we are in a very particular time of uncertainty about how this medium is going to evolve. And I think in some part it is good that such a monstrosity as generative AI has come, because that allows us to see art for what it should be, not as a product, as a finished polished thing that you sell for value in the market, but rather art should be art for art's sake. It should be created just to enjoy the process of creation and to allow creativity to flow through you. Inspiration is a beautiful thing after all, and if we reduce a work of art to just its final form instead of keeping into account that it has been a process of becoming, of which we can only perceive the final result, it loses a lot of the importance of creativity. Some artists have fully embraced doing that process, the art itself. For example, very simple one, there is a person called Sorel Souls that makes these very tiny cute frogs with 3D printing, and then she paints them. And to be honest, the frogs are very cute, but if I was only to see the final product, I would just look at it and be like, that's cool, and then move on. But because she shows the whole process of creation, that becomes way more engaging. We can also see a similar thing in the video games, particularly with indie teams and developers. It has become very clear lately that just a passion project that one or two people do over many years, simply because they enjoy doing it, can be way more meaningful and impactful than a big studio hiring hundreds of professionals just to create a product. Especially in the Games Awards, we have seen things like Expedition 33, although that's not really an indie game, but still, it is a passion project. Or we have other more classic examples like Hollow Knight or Stardew Valley. Even Balatro, for example, are all passion projects of their creators that spent as much time as they needed because they truly believe on what they were doing and they were focusing more on being creative rather than to put a product into the market. Another aspect of game development that resonates with process philosophy is the existence of beta testing communities. In this case, by opening the process of creation, and instead of having just one person or just a small group of people working on one creation, by opening up to a bigger community that are willing to engage in that process of creation, usually the end result is much more satisfying, both to the creators of the game, but also for the people that have put their thoughts and part of themselves into that community and into that game. They can see themselves reflected into something that otherwise would have been less impactful creation. And the best example of this are open source projects, in which the barrier between creator and people that enjoy it are dissolved, and anyone can become a creator and modify and participate on the creation of that project in particular. These are not only very successful, and once again make the possibility space of that creation much more rich and intense, but also gives a level of trust between both sides, because anyone can check the code of what they are using, and they can feel reassured that there is no ill intent behind it, or no, especially in the case of software, no spyware or deception happening from the creators and the developers. And of course, we have to talk about process and music. It is quite clear the distinction to anyone that has been to a live gig or a concert. Listening to something in your home or with headphones is a completely different experience than to being in a live performance. In fact, there are some music genres that only exist to be played live and to be performed. The classic example is, for example, jazz, because it relies very heavily on improvisation. But of course you can listen to jazz in your house and it sounds fine. But however, there are other music genres, such as noise music, in which the music, the result, is actually not that great. It's literally noise. But by being present during the process of creation, and by relating to the musician as they perform, it is a completely different experience. Also, what you've been listening this whole time in the background is what Steve Reich calls process music, which is a type of minimal music in which the creativity is not in the hands of the creator, of the musician or the artist, but rather is on the process itself. In this case, what I'm doing is applying some phasing techniques to the sequencer on my Deluge, and also triggering different non-predictable processes, such as random modulations and LFOs synchronized with another LFOs, and applying probabilities. So even though I have programmed the music and I have some idea of how it is going to sound, truly once the process begins, it is in the hands of the process itself to become the music that it wants to be. And lastly, another example of how abstract metaphysical concepts can be applied in reality comes in the form of modular synthesis. In this case, people that make music with modular systems are literally connecting together concepts For example, we can connect the concept of time, of a clock, with a concept of different divisions, for example Euclidean patterns. You can combine that with different harmonies and different musical scales, and with envelopes and geometrical shapes of all sorts, and with waves and such, and by literally creating relationships between them by plugging cables, you create music that way, which I think is truly wonderful. With that, I finished this presentation about process philosophy and how it can be applied to many different aspects of life. I hope that you enjoy it and that you find something interesting to do your own research, and that you have a lovely day. Take care.